For most of the 20th century, the Minoans were treated as Europe's first great mystery, a Bronze Age civilization that appeared, seemingly fully formed, on the island of Crete around 2700 BCE. They built palaces of extraordinary complexity. They developed one of the earliest writing systems in the Mediterranean world, a script called Linear A that has never been deciphered. They created art of breathtaking sophistication, frescoes of dolphins and bull leapers, and women in elaborate dress that feel startlingly modern, even 4,000 years later. They traded across the entire Mediterranean from Egypt to Anatolia, and then, somewhere around 1450 BCE, they collapsed. Their palaces burned, their writing disappeared, their civilization ended with a speed and completeness that archaeology has struggled to fully explain ever since. Into the silence they left behind, an enormous amount of speculation rushed in. Who were the Minoans? Where had they come from? And most compellingly, for the theorists who found the question irresistible, were they the source of the Atlantis legend? Plato had written about an advanced island civilization swallowed by the sea. The volcanic destruction of nearby Thera, modern Santorini, had shaken the entire eastern Mediterranean world. The connection seemed obvious, elegant, seductive. The Minoans as Atlantis, the lost civilization hiding in plain sight beneath the mythology. The DNA arrived in 2013, and it did not confirm the mythology. It confirmed something much stranger and much more important. The story of Minoan discovery begins with a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans, who excavated the Great Palace of Knossos on Crete, beginning in 1900 CE. What Evans found exceeded anything the Victorian world had expected to find in the eastern Mediterranean. A palace of over 1,000 rooms, evidence of running water and sophisticated drainage systems, art that bore no resemblance to Egyptian or Mesopotamian conventions, but had its own entirely distinct aesthetic vocabulary. Evans named the civilization after the legendary King Minos, whose palace in Greek mythology housed the Minotaur in its labyrinth. He was, almost certainly, looking at the reality behind the myth. But Evans also had a theory about where the Minoans had come from. He believed, based on comparative art history and architectural analysis, that the Minoans were related to populations from North Africa, specifically from Libya. His theory never achieved consensus, but it established the pattern that would follow for the next century. Everyone had a theory. No one had definitive evidence. The Minoans were proposed to be related to Anatolians, to Egyptians, to sub-Saharan Africans, to a lost Aegean population that had vanished from everywhere else, to refugees from a drowned civilization in the Atlantic. The problem was that without genetic evidence, the debate could not be resolved. Physical anthropology offered some clues, comparative linguistics offered more, but the Minoan writing system, Linear A, remained undeciphered and thus linguistically silent. The civilization spoke to us in its art and its architecture, but not in its words. And without its words, its origins remained open to the full range of human imagination. The 2013 study that changed the conversation was published in Nature Communications, led by a team including researchers from the University of Washington and several European institutions. The team extracted mitochondrial DNA from 9 Minoan skeletal remains recovered from a cave burial site in Crete called Hagios Charalambos. The skeletal remains dated to the Bronze Age Minoan period, making them among the oldest genetic material ever recovered from the Aegean at that time. The mitochondrial haplogroup analysis produced results that were, in the most precise scientific sense, unambiguous. The Minoans did not come from North Africa, as Evans had proposed. They were not closely related to sub-Saharan African populations. They were not, as some of the more dramatic theories had proposed, refugees from a drowned Atlantic civilization. Their mitochondrial haplogroups matched most closely with populations from Neolithic Europe and Western Anatolia, specifically the same Anatolian farmer populations whose westward expansion had populated much of Europe, beginning around 9000 BCE. In other words, the Minoans were, in their deep genetic ancestry, European. Or more precisely, they were part of the same Neolithic farming expansion that had spread from Anatolia into the Aegean, and from there into the broader European continent. They were not a mysterious intrusion from outside the known ancient world. They were, genetically, a Bronze Age Aegean population continuous with the broader pattern of Neolithic settlement that had defined the region for thousands of years before their civilization reached its peak. This was a significant finding. It placed the Minoans firmly within a known population history, but it also, immediately, raised a new and more interesting question. If the Minoans were genetically continuous with the broader Neolithic Aegean world, why was their civilization so dramatically distinct from everything else around them? Why did their art, their architecture, their social organization, their apparent position of women in society, their maritime trade network, all diverge so completely from contemporary Bronze Age cultures on the Greek mainland and in the broader Eastern Mediterranean? The follow-up genomic work, particularly a more comprehensive study published in 2017 in Nature by a team led by Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, expanded the analysis to include both Minoans and the Mycenaeans, the mainland Greek Bronze Age civilization that would eventually absorb and partially replace Minoan culture after the palace collapses. This study analyzed whole genome data rather than just mitochondrial DNA, providing a much richer and more detailed picture. The 2017 results confirmed and extended the 2013 findings. The Minoans showed ancestry overwhelmingly derived from the same Anatolian Neolithic farmer populations identified in the earlier study. But they also revealed something that the mitochondrial-only analysis had missed. The Minoans carried a small but detectable proportion of ancestry related to populations from the Caucasus and Iran, a component that would later be identified as part of the broader steppe-related ancestry that had transformed European populations during the Bronze Age. Crucially, the Mycenaeans, the mainland Greek Bronze Age culture that came after the Minoans, carried significantly more of this steppe-related ancestry than the Minoans did. This genetic difference between Minoans and Mycenaeans reflected a real historical process. The steppe expansions that had reshaped much of Europe during the Bronze Age had reached the Greek mainland more thoroughly than they had reached Crete. The island, geographically isolated in the southern Aegean, had absorbed less of the steppe-derived genetic input that was transforming populations on the continent. This finding resolves, at least partially, the long-debated question of the relationship between Minoan and Mycenaean civilization. The Mycenaeans were not, as earlier generations of scholars sometimes implied, simply the Greeks before Greek civilization. They were a population with a distinct genetic profile from the Minoans, reflecting a different mix of ancestral components. And yet culturally, the Mycenaeans absorbed enormous amounts from the Minoans. Their art shows Minoan influence. Their early writing Linear B was adapted from the Minoan Linear A. Their mythology drew on Minoan themes and sacred sites. The relationship between these two civilizations was not replacement but absorption, with the genetic newcomers taking on the cultural forms of the people they superseded. The Atlantis question, which the DNA effectively put to rest, is worth addressing directly because of how much intellectual energy it had consumed for decades before the genomics arrived. The argument that the Minoans were the historical basis for Plato's Atlantis story had a certain seductive logic. The volcanic eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE was one of the largest in recorded human history. The eruption and subsequent tsunami devastated Minoan settlements on the northern coast of Crete. Archaeological evidence shows clear destruction layers dating to this period at multiple Minoan sites. The parallel with Plato's account of an island civilization destroyed by catastrophe was striking. But the DNA demolished the core of the Atlantis hypothesis, not by disproving the volcanic connection, but by establishing the Minoans' true geographic origins too firmly for any lost civilization narrative to survive. Atlantis, in all its versions, involves a civilization whose origins lay outside the known ancient world. The Minoans were demonstrably, genetically, part of the known ancient world. They were Anatolian Neolithic farmers who had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated island civilization over 2,000 years. They were remarkable. They were not mysterious in the way the Atlantis mythology required them to be. What they were, and what the DNA confirms, is something more interesting than any mythological framework. They were the peak expression of what the Neolithic Aegean world could produce when geographic conditions, maritime technology, and agricultural surplus combined to generate something unprecedented. Crete's position in the Mediterranean, equidistant from Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Greek mainland, made it a natural hub for the circulation of goods, ideas, and people. The Minoans exploited this position with extraordinary sophistication. Their civilization was not a transplant from anywhere else. It grew, over 2,000 years, from the same Anatolian farmer roots that had populated much of Europe, in a specific geographic context that made something unlike anything else in the contemporary ancient world possible. The collapse, when it came, remains only partially explained. The Thera eruption weakened Minoan civilization, but did not end it. The final collapse of the palace systems around 1450 BCE came a century or more after the volcanic catastrophe. The 2017 genomic study offers a partial genetic perspective on what happened in those final centuries. The post-collapse population of Crete shows a marked increase in the steppe-related ancestry component, consistent with the arrival of Mycenaean populations on the island following the palace collapses. The Minoans did not simply disappear. Their genetic descendants continued on Crete, but they were absorbed into a culturally and genetically distinct population that had come from the mainland, carrying more steppe ancestry and eventually a different language. The Minoan language, Linear A, was never learned by the Mycenaeans. Linear B, the adapted script the Mycenaeans brought to Crete, encoded an early form of Greek, a fully Indo-European language. The linguistic world of the Minoans vanished with them, leaving behind an undeciphered script that may never reveal what language it recorded. The genetic world of the Minoans persists, diluted, in the population of modern Crete and the broader Greek world, carrying the Anatolian Neolithic heritage that the 2013 and 2017 studies made visible. Modern Cretans carry measurable genetic continuity with the ancient Minoans. The isolation of Crete through the medieval period, when the island's population was repeatedly disrupted by Byzantine, Arab, Venetian, and Ottoman occupation, paradoxically helped preserve certain genetic signatures of the ancient population. The thread is thin. It is heavily diluted by subsequent migrations. But it is there, connecting the people who live among the ruins of Knossos today to the people who built those rooms 4,000 years ago and filled them with paintings of dolphins leaping through blue water. The Minoans were never what the mythologists wanted them to be. They were not Atlanteans. They were not refugees from a lost continent. They were not a mystery imported from outside the known ancient world. They were the extraordinary product of a known world, a Neolithic farming population that had crossed from Anatolia into the Aegean thousands of years before their civilization reached its height, that had found on a large Mediterranean island the conditions that allowed something unprecedented to grow. The DNA does not make them less remarkable, it makes them more so, because it tells us that everything the Minoans achieved, all the art and the architecture and the trade networks and the social sophistication, was built not by people from somewhere magical and lost. It was built by the same people whose ancestors had built the megalithic monuments of Western Europe, who had farmed the river valleys of Anatolia, who had spread across the known world carrying seeds and pottery, and a way of living that preceded civilization by thousands of years. The Minoans were the culmination of something very old, and the fact that something so extraordinary grew from roots so ordinary is, in the end, the most remarkable thing about them. History does not require mystery to be astonishing. It only requires honesty about what the evidence says. And what the evidence says about the Minoans is that they were fully, completely, magnificently human, which is enough.